Hello class, good to see you. Today we are going to learn about ancient Egypt's government. Our focus question for today is, was the government of ancient Egypt an effective form of government? I want you to keep this in mind as you go through the videos and begin to answer this question in your head. In addition, I want you to think back to what you learned about Mesopotamia. I want you to compare and contrast the governments of Egypt and the ancient Mesopotamian empires we learned about. But before we get to some of the significant rulers of ancient Egypt, let's take a look at how ancient Egyptian life was organized. Ancient Egypt's social structure can be thought of in terms of a pyramid, with 6 distinct levels of social classes. At the top, you have the pharaoh. The pharaoh ruled society and was considered to be a god. Because the pharaoh was regarded as a god, his word was law. The pharaohs controlled all people, and they were pretty smart in how they organized them. Basically, the pharaoh set things up in this structure so that things would get done at each level. Below the pharaoh, you have the vizier, who was like an advisor. And then you had the high priest nobles, followed by the priests, engineers, and doctors. Below them, you had the scribes and craftsmen. And finally were the soldiers, farmers, and tomb builders. The classes at the top of the pyramid had fewer people and enjoyed higher status. So as you can see, the classes up here are smaller than the classes at the bottom, who had more people, but enjoyed less status. They were definitely lower in class as you got to the bottom of the pyramid. While this structure provided lots of order to the society, it was pretty rigid. There was very little chance of ever moving up to a higher class. So usually you stayed in the same class that your parents were. You were born into that, and that was your life. The thought behind this was, for example, if peasants stopped farming, then who was going to provide Egyptians with a stable food supply? Quick challenge question before we move on. Can you figure out who is missing from this structure? Do, 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 do. All right, time's up. The slaves. The slaves were not considered an important part of society, therefore were not thought of as part of any social class. Okay, so now that we've seen the social pyramid, let's talk a little more about each level. The first 2 top levels of the pyramid consisted of the government officials. So as I mentioned, the vizier served as the advisor to the pharaoh and also as the chief judge. On the same level, as part of the nobles, you had the chief treasurer, who collected taxes in the forms of goods like grain, cows, cloth, and silver, rather than money. The nobles also included the general of armies, who advised the pharaoh on war strategies and national security. All of the government officials had the favor of the pharaoh, and therefore lived good lives full of luxuries. Most had great wealth, fine homes, fancy jewelries, and plenty of time to do the things they enjoyed. So basically, if you were in Egypt, the top of the pyramid is where you'd want to be. Below the government officials were the priests. They had many, many rules to follow, including bathing multiple times per day, shaving their head, and avoiding certain foods that were associated with the lower classes, such as fish. The priests were pretty powerful, though, because they were in charge of the important religious rituals. And as you remember, and we've discussed over and over, in ancient Egypt, religion touched every part of people's lives. Religion was very important, and so therefore, so were the priests. The priests had different jobs. The high priest advised the pharaoh and oversaw religious ceremonies. Temple priests were in charge of the temples scattered throughout Egypt. Other priests handled more common concerns and requests, like supervising the embalming of the dead, think burials and the mummies, giving advice, and performing healings. Women were allowed to be priestesses in Egypt. They were generally regarded as equal to male priests, but their main duty was really to oversee the temples that were devoted to music and dancing. Below the priests, doctors, and engineers were the scribes. From our last chapter, we know what the main duty of the scribe was: to write. Life as a writer was very difficult. They went to school for a very long time to learn how to write, and they used various materials that we discussed before, like the reed pens, papyrus paper, and writing tablets to record their work. Despite the difficult lifestyle, there was one really big benefit of being a scribe. You could potentially rise up in social class. This was the only way that men could change social classes in ancient Egypt. Remember, for most Egyptians, you were what your parents were, and that was the way life was for you. Below the scribes were the craftsmen and the artisans. The artisans included carpenters, jewelers, leather and metal makers, painters, sculptors, potters, and weavers. All of those people who developed and created various arts and services. Often the work was difficult, though. They had a simple life. Basically, they did not live lavishly and worked hard at their craft, but they also had decent possessions, and sometimes they could do things they enjoyed. So, while the artisans often made beautiful goods for the upper class, they were rarely recognized for their work and received very little respect. Finally, at the very bottom of the social structure, we have the peasants. Because their duty was to farm the land, their lives revolved around the 3 seasons: flooding, planting, harvesting. Basically, when the winter was good, they worked hard planting and weather was good, they worked hard planting and harvesting crops. However, when it was flood season, the pharaoh called on them to build the pyramids. So basically, there was no rest for the weary. However, there were many peasants who enjoyed their lives. They were very happy to be able to work for the pharaoh, who, remember, was a god. They often sang in the fields as they worked to pass their time and show what they enjoyed. This kept their lives very simple. They slept, they worked, they ate. They could keep some of what they grew most of the time. However, they could also be penalized, which included beatings, if their harvest was poor. So this is a bit about the social classes of Egypt. We are going to now talk about the highest level of the social class, the pharaohs.